like to introduce Dr. Micah Zenko. Dr. Micah Zenko is our keynote speaker. He is an accomplished political scientist who writes about military affairs and has authored several books, including Red Team, How to Succeed by Thinking Like the Enemy, in which he devotes a chapter discussing the exercise we'll be talking about today. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Becca Wasser. Ms. Becca Wasser is a Senior Policy Analyst for the RAND Corporation, where she focuses her research on wargaming and U.S. defense and foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. She recently has developed a war game related to, or that explores how we can model gray zone competition. And then last but not least, Dr. Jeremy Sepinksy is a senior research scientist for the Center of Naval Analysis, where he is the lead war game designer. He's designed and facilitated more than 10 war games and for the Department of Defense, and covers a broad range of topics like logistics and cyberspace operations. So with such an accomplished panel of experts and practitioners, I'm very excited we can host a discussion, and I'm very excited for all of you to tune in. So I'm going to briefly talk about the topic for today as well. So Millennium Challenge 2002 was a war game conducted by the Department of Defense in July and August of that year. Adjusted for inflation, the exercise cost over $350 million, putting it at one of the largest and most expensive exercises ever conducted. It preceded the invasion of Iraq, and the exercise was modeled a simulated conflict between the United States and a Persian Gulf state, and concentrated on analyzing the utility and best practices for employing cutting-edge technology that was coming online and would be available in the near future, such as network-centric operations and the like. So when it was conducted in the years that follows, the war game became highly controversial because of the set of controversies that took place during the exercise itself. United States Marine Corps Lieutenant General Van Riper, commander of the Red Team, which represented the opposing force against the Blue Team United States, anticipated many of the Blue Team's efforts to implement these new technologies and network-centric strategies in their operation. So as soon as the exercise started, he struck a substantial blow to the Blue Team by employing low-tech solutions to sink a significant amount of Blue Team assets as they approached. The exercise's adjudicators, the White Team, paused the simulation and reversed this unexpected outcome. And the exercise was then resumed with a new set of restrictions placed on Van Riper's team, prohibiting them from defending against airborne attacks, destroying many of their missile assets. And so in protest, Van Riper resigned as commander and spent the rest of his time during the exercise as an advisor. So professionals and academics have denounced this exercise as highly flawed and note it corrupted the notion of what a war game should be. So one particular scholar, Dr. Micah Zenko, has wrote and thought about this at length. I'm now going to hand this conversation over to him to talk about this further. Dr. Zenko?
Real quick, we just got a question. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Asking whether this is going to be recorded. And yes, it will be recorded. We will send out a link to that recording to anyone who registered after the event. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, I forgot to mention that at the very beginning. Okay, so with Dr. Zenko, I'd like to hand the mic over to you, the virtual mic over to you now, and happy to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you, Hannah, for the invitation to participate on this panel with actual war gamers. I'm very much not a war gamer. I'm just somebody who studies intriguing national security issues. And the Millennium Challenge 2002 exercise was an issue that I had come into in the process of writing a book about red teaming. I had been collecting information for over 8 years, doing interviews, going out and sitting with red teams, reading every publicly available information I could about red teams. And my definition of red teaming, which is very different from a lot of the people in the field, basically boils down to alternative analysis, simulations, and war games. And I started looking for what were prominent examples of these that you could find in the press. And at the time, Millennium Challenge 2002 was the most well-known example. It was heavily featured in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, in part because Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper is a really profoundly, I would say, media savvy retired general officer who had suffered this sort of indignity while serving on the red team. But I was very skeptical about the way it had been portrayed as this just event through the lens of General Van Riper. If you if you don't know Gladwell's book Outliers, the quote 10,000 hour rule, like there's no such thing. It appears in a 1969 book by Herbert Simon, which was an estimate of how many hours a grandmaster needed to become a chess grandmaster. So like there was all these shorthand ways that this war game was being used, and largely because it was through the lens of Gladwell and Paul Van Riper, just two people. And one of the things that I'd really learned was that every prominent public example I could find of a red team, a war game, or a simulation was almost always reported wrong. Unless you know the participants, the scope, the intent, the funding, the overall objectives of any of these exercises, public representations of them are often heavily misleading or wildly inaccurate. So sort of with that thinking, priming myself, I decided to really dig into this over a period of time. And just to give you some context of what was going on, because almost everyone here will be way too young, what was going on when 2002 was the sort of background for when this event happened. First, you have to understand this was the peak of Donald Rumsfeld's powers. He was still sending out literally a dozen or more snowflakes, which were these memos that represented both guidance, information requests, and just badgering of mid-level Pentagon officials that were actually being responded to. And these were really intended to shape the priorities and the focus of people in the Pentagon. Rumsfeld was also heavily involved in reviewing the operational plans of every combatant command, down into really finite and granular details. So he was deep in the wargaming focus, thinking through the warfighter lens and making sure those old plans were up to snuff. And then he was obsessed with technological transformation. This was sort of the back end of what had been the revolution in military affairs. This was still when Army Chief of Staff General Shinseki was talking about getting multiple heavy divisions anywhere in the world in 72 hours. And this was primarily to do with both the back end of the sort of dual containment Iran-Iraq power, but heavily focused obviously on East Asia and China, as well as North Korea. So that's one piece of context. The other thing is this is when CENTCOM is at the peak of planning for the Iraq War. And a lot of the people at JIFCOM, Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, where this war game occurred, were also involved in some of that operational planning. And in fact, some of the ground component planners from CENTCOM came to JIFCOM to serve on the blue team for part of the representation. So there was Rumsfeld on top, and then a bleed over to ongoing Iraq war planning is happening. The third thing is there's strong disagreement among both serving general officers and retired general officers about the wisdom of the Iraq War. And this was on the Joint Staff, this was at CENTCOM, but most prominently people, if you know Greg Newbold and Admiral Scott Fry, these are people who were strong opponents of the war, but were serving in sort of operational planning roles. Paul Van Riper was also opposed to the Iraq War fundamentally, even in 2002. So there's Rumsfeld, the Iraq War, and then there's opposition to the Iraq War. So JIFCOM is placed in an impossible position when it comes to designing and scoping this war game. They're given a congressional mandate to do this. So this wasn't done because, and by the way, this congressional legislation was introduced into the original bill that came from the White House. So this was something the Pentagon wanted to do, but Congress supported it strongly. They funded it wildly, and they determined that this would happen. General Buck Kernan, who was the commander of JIFCOM at the time, wanted Paul Van Riper to serve as the lead of the red team. And when I went back and I was reviewing my interview notes with Kernan just the other day, one of the things he said to me was that he didn't even have a second choice. He said Paul Van Riper was the most important person for this. He had been involved in several earlier large-scale war games, the Joint Forces Command, which hadn't turned out successfully well. It was not, quote, free and fair play where the red team could win, but Van Riper was promised that this time it would be very different. So there was this underlying tension between Van Riper and his 90-person, well, at the peak of it, I should say, there was 90 people on his red team, which included a lot of senior advisors who really just served as sort of check-in points. So there's underlying tension, which was the sanctity of the war game and the game designers at GIFCOM, but the intended outcome had to mirror and match what the Secretary of Defense wanted, which was a defense planning construct that supported some of the weapons platforms and network-centric weapons platforms that Donald Rumsfeld had signaled he very much wanted to buy. So, you know, I won't get in much into what actually happened in Millennium Challenge, because I think Zach covered that quite adequately. But the game itself was corrupted sort of from the start, not just by the White Cell, which made the choice to place artificial limits on Van Riper that were introduced even after the scope and design and the rules of the game had been laid out. But there was, one of the other things people forget is there was a live fire activity of this. There were forces arrayed off the coast of North Carolina and San Diego, and there was going to be an actual live component with this. So the war game had to happen over the course of 3 weeks. Like it's a lot of money to send Marines off the coast of San Diego, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, to then simulate some sort of expeditionary landing over the ocean front. And so they had to corrupt it to some extent. But it was done in a way that signaled the discontent, not just with this activity, but with wargaming more broadly. And that was the thing that becomes the legacy of this. And so I think in some ways that's what's more interesting. I mean, if you don't know what happened, halfway through the exercise, Van Riper basically quits. He tells the deputy of the red team that he's going to resign. He then sends an email to about 20 people, knowing that it would leak. And it leaked in full, almost in full, within 3 days to Army Times. Sean Naylor got a copy of it. Once that happened, it got spun up in the New York Times, and then it became part of a much larger and much more significant story, which was, this was an effort of the Pentagon to try to misrepresent the types of threats that the United States would face in the Iraq War. The interesting thing was, though, that I don't think Van Riper had that conception of it. He was not a supporter of the Iraq War, for sure, in 2002, but he basically just thought that GIFCOM had spent all of this money and had run an exercise that was false and misrepresented the threats that these forces fielded in the future would face. And what he was most worried about was that there would be a press conference and a press release at the end of it, which signaled everything had gone well. And he wanted to anticipate that and get out in front of that. And subsequently he did. Unfortunately, there was never a real investigation of what happened at Millennium Challenge 02 until GIFCOM did an after action report, which runs over 700 pages. Very few people have ever taken the time to read, because it was sort of, at least by the Rumsfeld Pentagon, they wanted to forget it. And by this time, all eyes are turned towards Baghdad and are turned towards what is the, what was at the time, I think, Operation Rolling Thunder, or whatever operational plan it was being developed at the time. It was really all focused on Iraq, sort of exclusively. So just a couple lessons about war games that I took from this. I also do red team simulations. I do facilitated red team exercises. I do war games for a living. And I just had like 5 observations to sort of prompt some discussion amongst some of the folks on the line and the panel. And the first thing I really learned is that if you want to talk about human events, you have to talk to the humans involved. Van Riper had been interviewed multiple times ever since he leaked the email the email that he wrote, which he intended to leak, was leaked. But like, no one had ever talked to B.B. Bell, who was the head of the White Cell, or Buck Kernan, or any of the other people who were heavily involved in it. And as I always say to researchers, if you want to learn about the past, like, literally talk to the participants. And the best thing to do is talk to retired people. Like, retired people love to talk. Like, they love to be, they love to reminisce about the things they were involved in. And they love to tell you about some of these cases. And you know, in my book, Red Team, I interviewed about 250 people, and at least half of them were retired. And the conversations and the honesty you can get from them is unmatched compared to present duty, either military officers or certainly civilian sort of mid-career people who are extremely protected and extremely reluctant to talk about anything, especially that casts a negative light on either their service or those of their seniors. The second thing is the effectiveness of war games, simulations, red team exercises is wholly dependent on the interest, the time, the resources, the imagination of the participants. It is really an investment-based activity, and what you invest in it is consistent with what you get out of it. I do a lot of red team activities now that are unfortunately intended to pressure test a product rollout, a merger and acquisition, a strategy, and it's often a check the box activity, which is a senior leader, a VP of a business unit wants people to poke holes, challenge assumptions, but he or she isn't really interested. What they really want to give the appearance of pressure testing so they can say it happened, and they can meet the needs of either a regulatory or a senior leader requirement that you thought about things going wrong poorly. But it's really hard to do that, especially when you have an act in writing the plan, making the M&A decision, the product rollout. And so I have just found that it really depends on the people, the resources, the commitment, and especially senior level buy-in. If senior leaders don't want these to be done well, they don't resource them, give the access, and listen to the results, sort of nothing else matters. So that's a second finding. The second is I have learned that all of these exercises are to some degree artificial, right? That have some sort of end goal. They have overarching end goals. Their futures are uncertain. They're open-ended outcomes. And by design, they're scripted to some extent. In part because we don't even know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, famous favorite quotes is Tom Schelling, who said, you know, the one thing no one has any data about is the future. And that's certainly the case. So we make probabilistic estimates and we make sort of generalized forecasts about what will happen in our day-to-day lives. And the same thing happens in war games, right? And if you allow them to go down whatever path or track way you want, you run into the limits of people's time, attention, scope of the exercise. So there is some degree of artificiality built into it. That doesn't necessarily mean that's wrong, but I think it's worth recognizing that and acknowledging it. The fourth thing is just related to this is, again, I scope, run, and design these for nonprofits, governments, and the private sector. And there's really no silver bullet for how to do this, which is what people want. What people fundamentally want to do is say, like, well, just tell me how to do it and give me 2 hours. And my job, my whole career is about stopping people from starting. Because Americans in particular, all they want to do is get to the solution, and all I want to do is make them think about why. Because if you ask people, why are you actually doing this exercise? Why are you actually running this war game? It's a really almost uncomfortable conversation, but when you get down to it, it's almost fundamentally cultural. It's a senior leader priority or some other event. So you really have to, it's, you know, I always say the first step of red teaming is therapy, which is you have to sit with the senior leader, your point of contact, and have real honest conversations about what the intent is before you jump into it. Because a lot of the people just want to say, like, tell me when I got to show up, tell me what you need, how much money, and then we'll run them. But that doesn't lead to much success. Final thing is, even the most poorly run suboptimal war games have a high degree of value. They network the participants who I have learned shockingly often have never met before. These are people who work on a common problem set, geographically distributed, may never have an interaction with each other, may never have a sense of other people's interests or silos. So they network people. They create a sense of shared consciousness around a problem set. Because if you come together for 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours to discuss an issue, you will start to develop not a conventional wisdom and not necessarily groupthink yet, but you will have a better shared picture of the problem that you're facing than beforehand. And if you just had an open-ended conversation, again, using my favorite fake military acronym, BOGSAT, bunch of guys sitting around table, and if you just said, well, we'll just get in a big room, make a big pot of coffee, and then we'll talk about this, it's fundamentally impossible. There's no structure, there's no facilitation, there's no weighting, there's no priority. So you have to create some activity to create this shared consciousness, because on their own, people won't do it in an honest and forthright way. The other thing is it elevates the importance of this problem set amongst people, and it also creates some degree of prioritization for how to tackle it, which is really important for planning and strategy development. And the final thing is, which I didn't know until I sort of did this more and more, is when you do a war game, it reveals a lot about the organization's culture and values, which is what are the artifacts, what are the things taken for granted, what are the ways that people interact, the interpersonal relationships, the dynamics, what is the sense of the room or virtual room, the tension, because that tells you a lot about them. Even if you couldn't read anyone's lips or hear anything, you could learn a lot watching a war game. Body language, degrees of participation, to what extent some people are, as we like to say, socially loafing, hanging in the background, to what people are sort of forward and actively engaged and ambitious. So you learn a lot about people just by running through these exercises. So with that, I'll stop without getting into the focus of Millennium Challenge, but thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Zenko. That was very insightful, and I think it's going to open up the discussion to some pretty interesting points. So at this point, I'd like to remind the audience that you can start submitting questions using the Q&A function, and that I'd now like to open up the discussion to the panel with Becca and Jeremy as well. Given Micah's emphasis on kind of like why we're conducting war games and the extra sets of value that you can get from it, even though it can largely be considered a failure, I think a good place to start would maybe to be, can we challenge the traditional narrative of Millennium Challenge 2002 being a failure? Can we offer anything to challenge this narrative? What were the hidden successes in this event? And Micah, if you'd like to start, and then we can just open it up, or if anyone has anything.
I'll just say one thing is Millennium Challenge is now pointed to as the thing we won't do again. It is the archetypal negative case of what is to be avoided. And I think the lessons are, they're more complex than Malcolm Gladwell reported, and they're probably more complex than what I wrote in Red Team, but the lessons have been instilled and shared. Every time I give a PME talk, every time I'm in Newport or Leavenworth or Quantico, like, people know about it. And they know that when they design and run war games or any sort of simulation, these are some missteps to avoid. Undoubtedly, they are hitting other missteps, but if nothing else, it gives you a negative case to avoid.
Great, thank you. So I also wanted to kind of touch on some less considered notions of why wargaming might be useful. So things like socializing officers to new concepts. In this context, was the Millennium Challenge 2002 a failure, or was it useful in showing the limitations of this technology? Becca or Jeremy, I think this question especially would be good for you guys.
I'll jump in for a little bit, and I think looking at Millennium Challenge as a counterexample can be useful. However, is it worth spending that amount of money just to generate a counterexample, right? So it's a risk versus reward. Whether or not something can be successful, though, doesn't mean you have to do things like win. It doesn't mean you have to have something that you could point to on a sheet that says, yes, we hit our victories, right? There was a great exchange between then commander of US Transcom, General McDew, when he was talking on, I think it was the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was asked about a recent war game that he did, and he said, was it successful? And he looked back at the person who asked the question and said, well, it depends on what you mean by successful. I wish I had the quote, but he said something to the effect of, success in a war game is not winning. Success in a war game is learning something afterwards that you can do something with. So what you mean by success and what you mean by failure, if you walked away from Millennium Challenge and said, no, there's nothing I can do with the information that I've learned from this. If I have literally learned nothing, then it was a failure. But if you can walk away and say, I know how to do something better, whether that's run a war game better, whether that's execute a concept better, whether that's understand how to network all of these different pieces. If you can walk away with something that you've learned, you've probably been successful.
Great.
I'll just follow up on that, and I'll foot stomp Jeremy's point that sometimes the best games are the ones where the team or the set of players that are expecting to win are actually the ones that lose, because that enables them to start thinking about whether it's an operational concept, a strategy, an acquisition in a different light, in a way that might actually become a lot more productive to their planning. War games and games more broadly often will help you plan against a range of different futures or scenarios. And that's one way in which we can actually learn. I'll also sort of take the flip here, which is, yes, we point to Millennium Challenge 2002 as our example of what we ought not to do. And we give a lot of lip service to it. And by we, I'm saying sort of the National Security Department of Defense more broadly. But how much have we really learned? Because within the Department of Defense, within the armed services, you still see war games that are being run to achieve certain objectives. And some of these are productive objectives, but a lot of these are to essentially say that they've run a war game and it has blessed the operational concept, and they're pretty much pre-scripted, or the outcome has already been cooked. So while that is while that still happens, have we truly learned from some of our mistakes with Millennium Challenge 2002? And I think there's an element of think that happens around the halls of the Pentagon that means that, frankly, we haven't fully, and we don't fully understand what wargaming is good for and what it's not best used for.
Thank you, Becca. I think that's a really good point. Is what was the goal? What was it just to prove a point, or was it to discuss an issue? And so I'd like to kind of bring it over to Jeremy for a second, and then ask. I mean, did this exercise suffer from a poorly defined question? And in either case, it seems like it maybe not successfully answered that question. And then going from there, maybe we can talk more about some of the bureaucratic issues stemming from oversight and organizational issues with the military. But let's first hammer down, what was the issue of the question to start with?
I would argue that it suffered from too many questions. When you have something as large as that, you have it's almost impossible to find one single question that you can go forth and do. One of the most important things whenever I'm designing a war game for a military audience is sitting down and defining the question. Micah talked about making sure that you understand what it is. It's that philosophical moment at the start of a war game that defines the purpose of that thing. When you've got something as big as Millennium Challenge 02 that has the exercises, that has the live fire pieces, that has the wargaming pieces, that has all of the experiments, you now have lots of people bringing their own questions to the table. And one event can't answer those multiple questions. Whenever I try to build the objectives for a war game, I try to make sure I can limit it to no more than 3 objectives. Sometimes that means acquiescing to 5. But if you have $350 million to spend, you've got lots of different people that are putting lots of money on the table that want their thing answered. So if you don't have a really strong coordinating function that interleaves all of these and makes sure that everyone who's involved knows exactly where their question is getting answered, you run into some problems, and you're going to have stovepiping in pieces of those questions, and it's going to be almost impossible to coordinate something that large to get any real concrete answers out of. So when people see that lack of question happening, they're figuring out their own piece of it to answer their own questions, and that immediately starts to disconnect you from all of the other pieces. And I see the problem with the Red Team and Lieutenant General Van Riper as a problem of miscommunication. It's not necessarily that the White Cell did the wrong thing, it's that Lieutenant General Van Riper was trying to lead his team to do one thing, whereas the exercise planners were expecting something else. And his input was coming in the form of a war game input, when it's very likely that the thing that was happening was an experiment input, or it was a live fire exercise input. And those things, for safety reasons, have to be very tightly scripted. So it really all boils down to the communication and the identification of that question, and understanding the scope and the scale of the war game that you're trying to generate.
So I wanted to maybe clarify this a little bit. So adjudication then was not maybe so much the primary concern. It was just the questions that were being asked were not communicated correctly to participants.
I think it really depends on what you mean by adjudication in this case, right? In a traditional war game, adjudication is coming up with the outputs, the outputs of two competing objectives. When the blue team says they're going to do one thing and the red team says they're going to do something else, it's the white cell's job to adjudicate those conflicting answers to come up with the one thing that happens to be able to move forward. So if the white cell decided that what the red team was trying to do was adjudicated in favor of the blue team, in order to why, right? Why did the adjudication not favor the red team when it may have been obvious to the red team that the red team would win? But sometimes there are additional objectives that are going on, right? So if you have an exercise objective or an experiment objective that conflicts with that, if the red team is going to do something that's going to completely take everything off track for the experimental technology or the experimental concept that you're looking at, suddenly you've got a $5 million layout on the table that are you going to throw away that $5 million? You've got to come up with some way to square that circle and put those together. And it sounds like it was poorly communicated. Where is the free play and where is the red play constrained, and what are the boxes that the red team should have been put into? And it sounds like Lieutenant General Van Riper didn't have that information going into it.
Thank you. So I'd like to kind of pull back and ask more of a bigger picture question. And Mike, I think you'd be a good place to start from this. We talk about often like one of the biggest benefits of wargaming outside of the theoretical context is like understanding how participants may reach a conclusion or go about a set of actions, like understanding that thought process. So could you speak, and then I'd love to hear Becca and Jeremy also talk about this as well. Could you speak to the role that cognitive biases played in participants and the planners in this exercise, and how does that factor into discussions about questions that were supposed to be asked at the very beginning?
Yeah, I mean, you're making me think about, we're about a couple of days away from the 40th anniversary of Desert One, which was when, the Iran hostage rescue attempt, which is the sort of prototypical example where the core planning team, which was people who met in one room in the Pentagon for a course of 100 days and had no external review of its operational plans, basically fell in love with the plan. And if you've never, Admiral Holloway died just like 4 months ago, but if you've never read the Holloway report, which is the investigation into the operational plan to rescue the US hostages that were held in Tehran, it's really worth reading because you recognize all the biases that these individuals held about the strength of their plan, but then all the organizational pressures. Like, it was required to have a Marine participation in. And if you don't know the story, they're basically Marine helicopter pilots for no reason whatsoever other than Marines had to participate in the rescue mission to free the US hostages. And so, these sorts of individual cognitive biases, which are these, mental shortcuts, the heuristics, the rules of thumb that we take to get through the day are great. In the absence of doing them, I always tell people, if you tried to do effortful cognition for everything, you couldn't walk outside of your front door. You would just be overthinking everything. So we take shortcuts when we develop plans and when we run war games and when we think about strategy. The problem is when those shortcuts are fundamental to the strategy, the plan, or the war game. When they're sort of load-bearing assumptions that go untested, unexamined, unpacked, that's when real problems sort of emerge. And so it is always the case that these sort of biases exist. And that's why, you know, my rule of thumb is you can't grade your own homework. You don't trust anybody to evaluate the soundness of their plan, strategy, or project, because they're fundamentally incapable of doing it. So war games are a great way when, again, you have a empowered, motivated adversarial force to unpack some of those assumptions that aren't going to be found otherwise. And I always say the most successful outcome I have found for all these sorts of exercises, which sort of echoes on Jeremy's point, which is not about success, winning. It's when a really important aha moment emerges. An otherwise hidden insight, challenge, risk, vulnerability is suddenly floated to the surface as a result of the coordinated activity. And everyone in the room knows it. Like, that's really powerful. When everyone in the room goes, we missed that, like, that's a really catalytic moment because it's done collectively, it's shared. And again, it's uncovering those insights that on their own, the planners cannot find.
Thank you. So then I'd like to ask something to Becca, I think, then specifically about this, because Becca has written a lot. You go check out her pieces at RAND, they're great. Has written a lot about Russian gray zone tactics and sectarianism and security issues in the Middle East. And so specifically focusing on Russian gray zone tactics for a second, I think Micah's point about the aha moment is kind of important here. So when considering, arguably some people consider these tools to be new. It's a new Russian strategy in the Middle East to use these gray zone tactics. Now that can be debated at some other time, but when these new tactics and strategies present themselves either as tools for ourselves or for adversaries, what role should wargaming play in this?
So one of the things that wargaming is really good at is exploring different environments. My super smart colleague, Ellie Bartels, just published her dissertation in which she talks about different types of wargaming. And one of them is what she refers to as systems exploration. And here, when you have a new strategy come up or a new set of tactics, a new operational concept, particularly when it comes from a US adversary. So maybe the US isn't as familiar with it, or perhaps on the flip, maybe an adversary isn't as familiar with a new US strategy. You can use war games and different types of games, whether that's a political military game, a strategy game, to actually start breaking down this unknown environment, this unknown strategy, this unknown concept into bite-sized pieces and representing that in a game. And so it's a really good way in which games can be used to help people digest a problem and understand various parts of that in a way that is much more accessible than just perhaps pontificating about it or talking about what a new and novel problem it is from the outset. So developing games to help break things down and make them more understandable, to take these sticky issues that no one truly can wrap their heads around. Games both help you identify the parts that you already know, so the various elements that you are already familiar with, and can use that to leverage, to talk about, to enhance your understanding, or to then break things down further, or to just understand how the different concepts or environment could be used. And that's one of the things that we've done with some of our gray zone wargaming, and that's definitely something that we've seen historically with a bunch of games being used for this systems exploration. And I mean, frankly, I think we're going to continue to see more of this as we try to understand some of the newer concepts that have been touted in the national defense strategy. And frankly, as our adversaries get smart on some of our approaches, as well as technology advances further.
So going off that, Jeremy, you actually wrote a piece in War of the Rocks last year about some of the perceived tension between wargaming and other analytical tools like operations research or systems analysis. Given Becca's point, can you kind of give us a shape of like where wargaming fits in that broader picture of how we analyze these issues, or is it especially useful, or is it just part of is it one component part of the whole set of analytical tools?
Yeah, it's important to think about wargaming as a component of the analytical tools. You're absolutely right, and I wholeheartedly agree with Becca's comments on how it helps to explore the new things. Right, it helps take some of those unknown unknowns and put them into the known unknown category. So, but you can't do anything. You can't really move the ball forward unless you think about it in the holistic picture of everything else that needs to happen. Just because you take an unknown unknown and move it to a known unknown, it's still unknown, and you have to do something else to find out more information about it. And war games are not the best thing for everything. War games will not take an unknown and turn it into a known. You need some analysis, you need some exercises, you need data, you need studies, you need math, you need simulations. You need to throw the whole gamut at this. And a part of the piece of that, the point of that War on the Rocks is it's not just the wargamer's job to answer all of the problems. And as was said before on this panel, like a war game, when you're doing a war game just because you want a war game, you're missing the point. A war game needs to fit into a larger analytic process and a larger analytic picture.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to move to just one follow-up question on that point for all three of you before we move to the Q&A session, and I'd like to thank our audience. We've had some great questions so far on that. So then, given what you just said, like talking about second and third order consequences for actions, is wargaming a useful tool for that comparatively towards other sets of tools? Or I know you just talked about how it doesn't change an unknown to a known, but does it help bound those effects in a way that could be better done than other sets of tools? And this is for all three panelists.
Becca, do you want to take a first stab at that one?
Sure. So what wargaming is best used for, in my opinion, is its benefit is that it harnesses humans. So wargaming is best when it harnesses those human perceptions, knowledge, frankly, even their cognitive biases, in a way that is incredibly helpful in trying to move things forward. And here I will make my pitch for diversity in wargaming and the national security field more broadly. And I know it sounds like I'm going off message, but I swear I can tie it all back together. All of those matter. And so if we don't have different voices and perspectives in the room, we're not going to be able to build stronger games, and we're not going to be able to glean the insights from games that we're going to need to. So as Jeremy's article pointed out, and as he and others have talked about at length, wargaming is best used in a broader cycle of research where you have different different fields coming in. It's the same thing with having more diverse voices in wargaming, having mathematicians, ORSA, operations researchers, having people with those different backgrounds. That's a way in which you can actually take those, harness them, and use them to build better games, run better games, and to actually get insights from those games that help us understand these issues, help us do better planning, help us use war games in a way that are much more effective than perhaps maybe how we have in the past. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but I thought that was really important to point out and really important to highlight when so much of wargaming really revolves around individuals and people.
Thank you, Becca. I think that was a good point to make, and a great way to kind of close out the panel. I do have a good list of a pretty long list of questions here from the participants in the audience. So let me start. So Mike Obach, actually, this is important, and I think it would be, I can answer this, but I think it'd be best if the experts did. He's asking if we can ensure an understanding between the differences in red cell, red team, and wargaming versus a war game. And this is for all three of you, or any of you.
Boy, that's, you know, I have to be careful because to most people, I spend a lot of time with hackers, and the red team is the people who, you know, break into your computer network and implant malware or kidnap the CEO. So, you know, that's how most people think of it. That's the vulnerability probe sort of pen testing side of it. But I always think of a red team exercises it's again, my typology is alternative analysis, simulations, war games. And what I'm really mostly focused on is something that requires external facilitation, structure, formal structure, and some degree of prioritization and weighting. So it's a facilitated exercise that is intended to open the aperture amongst people to have discussions and conversations and share information that they otherwise could not do. And that's done through a lot of the anonymity. We use a lot of sort of writing and thinking and brainstorming tools, but it's ultimately intended to sort of converge back to a better understanding of this issue that was under discussion. And that's a sort of broad systems thinking's way that I describe red teaming. And then sort of the wargaming that I see, at least especially in the private sector, is sort of anything where you have competition between one or more competitors or stakeholders with relative wins or losses, with relative gains and losses. And so, you know, a great example of this is, I always say, like, if a pharmaceutical company has a drug going off patent, they will do war games that essentially simulate the responses from the regulators, from their customers, from the pharmacies themselves, from their competing firms. They model the way they respond, and they try to improve their ultimate way that the strategy for how their drug goes off patent. So that's sort of my conception of it. But one of the other things I've learned in the sort of red teaming space is people are actually really proprietary and closed-minded. Unfortunately, you think red teamers aren't, they actually are. They have very narrow ideas of what it is and then what it isn't. And it's sort of like, it's almost like the Torah says, this is red teaming, other things aren't. I tend to take a more expansive and open view to it because I don't want to exclude people from being engaged in the fields.
Thanks. Thank you. That was really good explanation and good kind of clarification on how we can kind of conceptualize it as a whole. Matthew Jones asks if each of the panelists can offer best practices or even challenges to the Department of Defense or private entities in operationalizing the lessons you learned from these kinds of games.
So I'll start off by noting the biggest challenge is the fact that lessons learned from war games aren't accessible. They are not accessible more broadly to the public, and they are most certainly not accessible even within the Department of Defense itself. When former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work moved to reinvigorate wargaming, one of the things that got stood up was this wargaming repository at the Department of Defense, where there was this massive outreach effort to try and identify all of the war games that were run for DoD. So that involves, you know, Office of the Secretary of Defense, all of the services, but also all of the federally funded research and development centers, which Jeremy and I both work at FFRDCs, as well as other stakeholders. So that was a massive effort. They had to identify what those war games were from the past, as well as identify some of their lessons learned. And it went into this repository, which is classified, and not everyone has access to it. So oftentimes what you see occurring is, one, there's redundancy in games. And sometimes redundancy is good because people approach the same issue in different ways that can be really helpful to finding out various answers, but sometimes it's literally just rinse and repeat, which is unhelpful to anyone. So you have a problem with some of this redundancy, but also just the lessons learned not being uniform. And because they're not accessible, we can't actually learn about them. Additionally, because so many of these games were in the past, people had moved on to other jobs, other deployments, whatever it was, the lessons learned tend to be a little thin. So it's really hard to create that community that understands the lessons learned from previous games and sort of build that into the work that has been ongoing, not only within wargaming, but also within the Department of Defense more broadly, with some of the operational planning and the strategy development and force development that goes on. So I would say that that is the biggest challenge for any attempt at operationalizing lessons learned from war games, and something that is a huge problem, which frankly, DoD doesn't even know how to get over the hump of.
It seems to be kind of like an issue with knowledge management and just facilitating the maintenance of talent and information. So Jacob Powell asks, in his experience at SICE, simulations tend to go towards encouraging more extreme reactions. In reality, he thinks so that the tendency is to do something more towards de-escalation and preserving the status quo. Is there a way to make war games reflect this inertia or bias towards the status quo, or should that not be the point?
So I'll start with some a short comment on that and say that there are biases that everyone brings to the table when they're playing in war games. Stephen Downes Martin has a good article on the biases that people bring to the table, and the risk bias is one of those. It's you're more willing to accept more risk when you're playing in a game than you would in real life. There's less real things at stake. And unfortunately, I think the answer is there's no way to get around these. There's no way to stop it. There's no way to avoid those things that people bring to the table. So the best thing that you can do is plan for them. You can try to design your game such that you mitigate them. You can ask people to recognize those biases in ways and notice them, so that way hopefully they can avoid acting in accordance with those biases. But no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to get rid of them completely. So you have to make sure that you scrub your data and you understand when people are acting like that, and use that when you're analyzing your war game and developing the insights.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to, someone has a question about, briefly, I want to touch on this one briefly, and then I'd like to ask each of you one final question before we head out. This is anonymous, I don't know who, but they're asking about the level of corporate influence in war games. Since each have a large technology component, do these war games have financial interests at play? And what are the likelihood that war games are established to make financial interests look positive or more viable? For instance, Lockheed's new jet working as intended, or selling it more so to policymakers?
I'll offer just a quick thought, which is that, you know, it is the job of the war game designer to be a disinterested party. And that is one of the most important things. I always say to people, like, I help companies like set up red teams to work through problem sets. But I always say, like, these people cannot have a vested interest in the outcome, because once they do, or they have a reputation around it, it just corrupts the process or the perception of fidelity. So, you know, I think that some of the higher level, you know, sort of lobbyist or corporate influence on some of these war games doesn't happen. But, you know, there's a reason in Northern Virginia, lots of people on, you know, military industrial complex and lobbying boards are former general officers who are friends with some of the people running the games now. So you can't pretend there aren't, you know, interpersonal relationships and dynamics between them. But to the greatest extent possible, you have to isolate yourself from whatever the outcome is going to be.
All right, thank you. All right, so Arthur Ackerman, I think, asks a good question we can end on this evening. And he asks each of the panelists if they could hammer one lesson into the current heads of US wargamers, practitioners, and policymakers, what would that be?
That's a great question, and I'll fall on the sword first for this one. And I would say the biggest problem that I've had with running war games is sponsors not knowing what a war game does and not knowing what they want to do with it. So instead of coming to the game and saying, I want a war game because I want a war game because I'm told I need a war game because Congress says I want a war game or because my boss says I want a war game. Understand what you're trying to get out of it and understand the limitations of a war game and what you can and can't do. And if you can take the time to understand what a war game is and that it's not a generic tool that does everything, that it's very specific and will help you a lot if you use it for what it's for. So that's what I would really like the majority of folks to learn.
I would say the one thing is people, as Becca pointed out, should read Ellie Bartel's dissertation, which is like the best and most readable modern history of war games, some of what happened at Rand, and a sort of clarion call for introducing more rigor into the practice itself. So that's my one thing. But my other thing is it's really hard to get people to do any preventative activity. I spent many years in the conflict prevention field, and it's really hard to get people to think about how do we address the underlying causes, the drivers of interstate or intrastate warfare? How do we prevent an event from occurring which hasn't occurred yet? And to a lot of people, war games, red team simulations are preventative activities that are nice to do but aren't must-dos. And subsequently, they often get discounted for what they can achieve. They get under-resourced, undervalued, or people just sleepwalk through them as a check-the-box exercise. So it's really, I think one thing that a lot of people in this community have to do better is elevating the importance of preventative activities. And I can just tell you over the last 5 or 6 weeks, there's been a huge upswell of interest in red teaming because of the current crisis. And I've actually documented this, the history of red teaming basically follows crises, which is the mid-90s, South Asia nuclear test, 2001, the Iraq insurgency, 2004, that's how Red Team University gets started at Fort Leavenworth. Financial crash, then people go, what are black swans? We need to do something about this. And so now again, like people are like, oh, we should have thought about this in advance. So, you know, until there's the painful recent event, people just sort of forget the utility of any preventative activity and getting them to recognize the next painful event is going to occur. Your job is to get in front of it and try to reduce or mitigate against some of the consequences of it. Sorry.
So I'll go really quickly because I know that we're short on time. I just want to foot stomp everything that Jeremy said. It is 110% spot on. I will also say that his comments apply not only to sponsors of games, but to wargamers themselves. So understanding the limitations of what a game can and cannot tell you is incredibly important, because I can't tell you how many times I see war game reports or people talking about war games in a way that overstates what they can actually tell you. And if I read a war game report that says this war game proves, I'm putting it down, because your war game doesn't prove anything. It gives you insight into something. It can help you solidify findings with other areas of research and other disciplines involved. So I think understanding what games can and cannot provide and the limitations of that, and then appropriately caveating them, is something that, you know, I would love all US wargamers to just get right on board with right now, because we're ultimately doing the entire field a disservice by continuing to not fully recognize those limitations and speak about them in the correct way.
All right, thank you, Becca. I think that was a great last question to end on. I think a lot of important points were touched there. So I'd like to thank today's panelists, Ms. Becca Wasser, Dr. Jeremy Sepinksy, and Dr. Micah Zenko for joining us. We're all silently clapping behind muted mics, but I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think it was a lot of invaluable information for myself and the audience alike. I'd also like to thank the audience for participating, and my co-president, Hannah Dennis, for helping me set up all of this. So if you guys missed any of this or want to go back, this recording will be live soon. I'll send out a link to the recording so we can go back and look through it. Thank you all for a thoughtful and entertaining panel, and I'm so appreciative of the enthusiastic level of engagement. Thanks, everyone.